When you're building a modern web application, most of the time you're going to be needing to use forms in some way, shape, or form. And when you use forms, you're essentially just collecting data, you're collecting input from a user, and then you are validating that input and then saving that input and storing it to a database. And this all happens within the context of your application. These forms might take different shapes. You might be calling a post request or a put request or a patch request, depending on the type of form that you're using. And these are all standards that have been implemented across the browser, across the web. But how do you use forms from a syntax standpoint within Laravel? So we're going to take a quick look at Blade, Livewire, and then Inertia with React and TypeScript, and how you can use forms to input, to validate, and then to save data to the database, and which one of those options, which one of those flavors, those different starter kits within Laravel might work best for you and your style and your application. So to keep things simple, we're going to be building the same form across Blade, across Livewire, and across Inertia with React. It's just adding journal entries to a database. So a user has multiple journals they can create, and a journal is simply a summary, which is one or two or three words, essentially a sentence. It's notes, and these can be longer form, and then a rating that we're storing. So how would we build this with Blade, using a little bit of Alpine, with Livewire, and then Inertia, and how would those forms talk to the server, keep validation on the server, and then actually store that and save it to the database? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Let's take a look. Okay, we're a little scrunched for space, but each one of these panels represents the different flavor of Laravel that we're going to be taking a look at when it comes to form implementation. We have the Blade on the far left, we have Livewire in the middle, and then we have Inertia with React on the right. Now, the front end looks exactly the same. It all acts and feels exactly the same. The differences and similarities are going to lie in how the form structure, how the data manipulation, how the validation, how the data input, and also the data pushing to post to the server, what that looks like on the back end. So let's go ahead and just create a journal just to show what this looks like. So in our Blade, we'll say my day was fantastic and hectic. What's one or two things you don't want to forget? I created a video about forms in Laravel. And I'm just going to say this is a solid 9. Let's save that. You can see we have this saved here. We have that there. Just for speed's sake, I'll show you kind of like each input. So unless you put on your developer hat and you did some digging within the developer tools, you wouldn't really be able to tell which one is which. So what do the actual form components look like? So again, Blade on the left, Livewire in the middle, and React with Inertia on the right. Now you'll notice that the web routes file are very similar. In the dashboard for each of them, we are sending the journals to the view. Those journals are just saying for the auth user, we're going to grab the journals and order them by created at descending and get. And each one of those is exactly the same, whether that's in Blade, that's Livewire, or in Inertia. Inertia is just going to look a little different because we're calling Inertia render. Okay, now what about the post one? Now we're going to talk about the post version before we actually take a look at the front end, because this is where it's saying, okay, how is this actually being saved and validated on the back end? You'll notice in Livewire, we don't have a post because we are actually doing that in the Livewire class itself. We didn't actually create a route for that, or most of the time, if you're working in a full Inertia React app or a full Blade app, you probably would put this into a controller instead of keeping this in the web route file. But for simplicity's sake, I just put it into the web routes for us to take a look at. So you'll notice that within the Blade and within the Inertia, it's exactly the same. We have this route post to /journal, and we're saying we're validating this information so that we have the summary for required string minimum of 3, a notes, sometimes it's nullable, string minimum of 5, when it is not nullable, and then a rating required. It's numeric, minimum of 0, maximum of 10. And we have the exact same thing over here. And then we're just creating the journals in the sense that we're attaching it to the user. This is in our user model as a method of journals to say we're going to create a new one and then pass in the validated info. And then we're just redirecting straight back to the dashboard with the status of journal added. And here we're just returning back because actually Inertia handles that status for us. Okay, let's switch over to the actual markup, the actual templating system for each of these forms. Okay, this isn't meant to be a deep dive into what the difference is between React, a templating language like Blade, and then Livewire. This is just to show the differences in how these forms would look like, how they're submitted, and then how they're intercepted on the back end. We already saw the post routes to /journals, but how are those actually submitted? The first thing I want to take a look at is the difference in form methods. So here in this Blade form, we have a form method of post, and then we're calling the action route. We're saying, hey, I want to post this information to the route journal.store. That's the one that was set up in the web routes file. And then we have an @CSRF directive, which is saying that we don't have to worry about cross-site request forgery. Everything is good to go. Now, how this is actually being pulled from the status, if we were to go back into the web routes and it's being stored by grabbing the summary, the notes, and the rating, is it's using the actual input itself. So we have an x-text-input, and because this is wrapped in a form, and specifically because we have this text input with an ID of summary, that's being pushed along with the form to this post route, where we're saying on submit, that's this X primary button right here. To save this on submit with this form, we're pushing all that info, the rating, ID of rating, we have the ID of notes, and then the ID of summary. Because we have input errors for each of these fields, and these are all in the Laravel Breeze scaffold, these input error components. Because we have those input errors, we then can use that validation to say, okay, if this doesn't happen within summary or notes or rating, then I want to show that to the user on that error. And this works the same for all of those forms. For example, summary field is required. The summary field is required. The summary field is required. In each iteration, in each flavor of Laravel, we have those validations because of those components that Laravel Breeze provides out of the box. For Livewire, we have wire submit, and that's going to be passed to a method and save in our Livewire class component that we'll see in a little bit. But each input field, instead of using the ID and then passing that along with the form request like the Blade would do, we have wire model, where we're saying we're modeling this and syncing this up to the form.summary field. In this sense, we're saying that this input should then be passed to the form.summary value. And then in React, we have an onSubmit handler where we're saying we're going to call the add journal entry function. And then each ID, each text input has a value of data.summary as well as a ref that we'll take a look at in a little bit. Okay, so how are these forms actually submitted? We already kind of saw this with the Blade form because it's the most simple, because it's just standard web standards where you have a form, you have those inputs on the form. Because of this CSRF, we don't have to worry about any kind of cross-site request forgery, and then we just say we want to create a form with a method of post to this particular route, and then that's it. Because this is all happening on the server, it's sending a full page request to that route that we set up in web.php, where we have this route post. And that's it for Blade. What about Livewire? Well, this is where it gets a little bit trickier because there's a lot of things that we've obfuscated within this Livewire class component. So we have our Livewire class. That's going to be the add journal entry class. We saw that we are calling wire submit save for this component on our markup on our front end. On wire submit save, when that button is clicked, it's grabbing all of the elements from that form and calling this public function save. You can see here that this is calling the this form store method. Well, what is that? We'll take a look in a little bit. Then after it calls that, it's dispatching a journal added. We'll take a look at that in a little bit as well. And then redirecting to the route dashboard. So what is this form store? Well, Livewire has form components that you can take to kind of replicate and use them as additional components within your application. So for example, if you wanted to have another journal form somewhere else in your application, well, instead of doubling that out, even if you wanted to have different markup for that form, what if you wanted to still have the same validation and the same way of storing that data on the back end? Well, that's what this journal form component is. Let's take a look. Journal form. Well, here's where we actually have our validation. So just like this web input where we're doing the validation here, we're doing this in our Livewire form component where we can validate the summary. That's where we have that form.summary on our front end, the notes, as well as the rating. And then the store method is where we can call validate and then actually create that journal. In the sense we're saying, okay, for every user, the user who is currently logged in, we're going to add a new journal, create a new journal for that user. And then this poll basically just says we're grabbing all of the fields that are associated with this form, summary, notes, and rating. We're resetting those fields on the front end and then using those to input into the journal model. Now, you can see here that in our add journal entry, this is where we're calling this form store. So again, this is just another way to replicate this form data, this form structure on the back end without having to have all of that in this one add journal entry Livewire class. Now on to React and Inertia. Now all of this is mostly going to be contained in this one singular file. And you can actually do that with Livewire if you wanted to, instead of having those separate components where you have a PHP file and then a Blade file with your markup. You can do it all in one file with Livewire Volt, and basically none of the actual syntax and the actual classes itself could change if you didn't want it to. But we're going to take a look at React. So within React and Inertia, you have use ref, which is basically just saying that we want to keep this state stored on the client until it's actually being input. This would be similar to Wire Model, where you're storing it, but it's not stored and synced to the server, whereas Wire Model is. This is all on the data state in the client. Then this is specific to Inertia right here. We have everything within a use form hook, a use form component that Inertia provides out of the box, that we're saying we have our data, we have our errors, and all of those components, all of those states, those variables are going to be used within this particular form. So we have our summary, we have our notes, and then we have our rating. And then we're calling this add journal entry. Again, this is that function that we called within the on submit handler within our React form. We're basically just saying we're going to prevent the default, and then we're going to post a route to that route of journal store. Again, this is the one that we created on our web routes journal store right here, where we have the validation on the server side. And that validation is going to be linked up with these errors, where we can say if there are any errors, that's where we can focus those particular fields. Again, this is all Inertia specific because it's tightly mingled with our React front end and then our Laravel backend. We can say on success, we reset the form. Then we're going to be reserve scroll as well to give you kind of that SPA functionality. Okay, I had to jump in here real quick as I was editing because there's some refactoring that could be done for the Inertia React side, specifically within that use form function that's given to you by Inertia. I was using useRef, which is great if you have initial state that you need to set on the component. For example, I was pulling a lot of that from the update password form, which have an existing password, that a current password that you would need to use or perhaps set, for example. But within our add journal entry form, we can make this a little bit cleaner. For example, we can use the set data property within this use form. And this use form here has a whole bunch of stuff that you can use. This is TypeScript within Inertia, so you have all of these different values, different functions, different methods that are available within this component, within this function. So if I was to go back to our add journal entry form, we have set data that we can call then on our inputs. So instead of having to call all of the error messages here to do that error handling here, we can just use the specialties, the niceties that are provided within that use form function. So for each text input, the value is data.summary. Again, data is relative to whatever you have set up here. And then the set data is for the onChange handler. So we can say we're going to set data to the summary with the target value. And then same thing with errors. We can say for this error, we want the errors.summary. So it's as simple as that. The use form function provided by Inertia, that helper function, is incredibly valuable. Back to it. Okay, before you go, one last thing I want to take a look at is you probably saw the saved text that came up after you hit submit on the front end. We can do a little flashback here to show you. Well, how does that happen? Because it actually works differently across each flavor that we're showing. Within Blade, within Livewire, within React, with Inertia, it all works differently. Let's take a look at Blade. We have in our post route for journal store, we have at the end appended on this with status journal add-in. This is basically just saying we want to pass a session status back when this form is submitted. We're redirecting to the dashboard, and then we're including a session status of journal added. Now, where does that come into play? Well, if we look into our add journal entry Blade template here, at the very bottom, we have this @if session directive, where we could say if that journal added session status is available, if it's actually loaded within this page, then we're just going to use some Alpine to show this saved text. And there's some cool functionality where that kind of fades out as well. How does it work in Livewire? Well, that's where this dispatch comes in, where Livewire is saying, okay, once this save method has actually been run, I want to dispatch this journal added text. In this case, this is a journal added function that we can then watch in our actual markup. So in the add journal entry markup, at the very bottom, we can see this X action message on journal added. And this is a component that's used and given to us within Laravel Breeze to basically just make all that a little bit simpler. We're saying when there is a journal added Livewire emission, a Livewire message, we're going to add this text saved. And within React here, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see here this transition component. And again, this is similar to what we see in that X action message component. This is given to us within Laravel Breeze to make these a little bit easier because you use them all the time. You want some kind of affirmation to say, hey, this form worked the way you intended. And that's what this transition says on show of recently successful. Now, where is this coming from? Well, it's actually the use form hook, the use form method that is provided within Inertia. So we have all of this for the summary, notes, rating, and because we have this recently successful variable within the use form function, then we can say anytime we actually use that form, actually we post it with this add journal entry, we are going to call that recently successful and show it here. It's a nice helper function that's provided out of the box with Inertia with things like processing, where we know that we're making this form request because Laravel and Inertia is so tightly knit. It's the glue to hold both of this front end and back end together. We know when a form is processing, and we know when a form is recently successful. So now we have those variables to actually do things when that has happened, or is going to happen, or is happening. Forms are the backbone of your application. Whether you're using something like Blade within your markup, you're adding a little bit more magic within Livewire, or you're using Inertia with React or Vue or Svelte, forms are something that you use across your application. So you might as well get used to how to work in them within your particular flavor of Laravel. So hopefully this just gave you a quick glance into the differences and the similarities to input data from a user to take input from a user and then validate it and save it to the database.